Imagine a world where every man abandoned his strength, where no one stood to protect. No one bore responsibility, no one chose to lead. That world would not be safer. It would be fragile, chaotic, and collapsing under its own weight. The real question we must ask is not whether masculinity is dangerous, but what happens when strength is left without responsibility, without virtue, and without discipline. That is when masculinity becomes toxic, and that is the challenge we must confront today. Masculinity itself is not toxic. It is essential for civilization, order, and protection. To suggest otherwise is to ignore the historical and psychological truth of human development. Men have been builders of cities, defenders of nations, and fathers of families. Masculinity, in its essence, is the capacity to take on responsibility, to bear burdens willingly, and to transform chaos into order. Without these qualities, societies would disintegrate into weakness and instability. It is precisely masculine energy that allows human beings to construct stable hierarchies, develop infrastructure, and create systems that function reliably under stress. Masculinity, properly understood, is the ability to endure hardship, confront danger, and push forward into the unknown. These are not vices. They are virtues that have allowed our species to survive and thrive across millennia. What has happened in modern times, however, is the distortion of this narrative. Masculinity is often portrayed as inherently harmful, as though the presence of strength, ambition, or authority automatically translates into oppression or abuse. But that accusation is both inaccurate and deeply destructive. It removes from men the very qualities they need to stand upright in the world. If we discourage strength, what will remain when society is threatened by violence, natural disaster, or even moral decay? Civilization itself rests on the shoulders of those who are willing to take the weight of responsibility, and that willingness is largely fueled by masculine traits. The demonization of masculinity is, therefore, an attack not just on men, but on the structures that uphold culture and order. We must also recognize that masculinity is not merely physical strength, but psychological fortitude. It is the ability to control impulses, delay gratification, and act decisively in the face of uncertainty. These are traits that build businesses, establish stable governments, and protect vulnerable individuals. Masculinity calls upon men to sacrifice their own immediate desires for the sake of something greater: family, community, or nation. That sacrificial element is not toxic. It is noble. It transforms what could be raw aggression into directed energy that serves a meaningful purpose. The very act of striving toward competence and mastery in any domain is a masculine pursuit, and society flourishes when such pursuits are encouraged. To deny the importance of masculinity is to invite weakness, and weakness is not harmless. A society of men stripped of their natural virtues will not become peaceful and safe. It will become fragile, chaotic, and resentful. Nature itself is harsh, unforgiving, and demanding, and only those who can face it with courage and resilience can carve out stability from its unpredictability. Masculinity equips men with the courage to confront that harshness and the drive to impose order upon it. Men who embody this principle become the guardians of their families, the protectors of their communities, and the builders of structures that last beyond their lifetimes. To call such qualities toxic is to misunderstand their essence entirely, and to undermine the very foundation of human endurance and progress. Toxicity emerges when masculinity is disconnected from responsibility, discipline, and moral grounding. Strength on its own is neutral. It can be used to build or to destroy, to protect or to harm. What determines the outcome is whether that strength is directed by responsibility and guided by principles that restrain its misuse. A man who possesses power without accountability becomes dangerous, not because masculinity itself is corrupt, but because it has been severed from the virtues that give it purpose. Responsibility is the structure that channels raw potential into constructive action. When that structure is absent, masculinity turns inward on itself, manifesting in selfishness, exploitation, and recklessness. Discipline is equally necessary because without it, strength becomes wild, chaotic, and destructive rather than ordered and productive. Moral grounding provides the compass that keeps masculine energy aligned with what is just and beneficial. Without it, ambition can transform into greed, confidence into arrogance, and authority into tyranny. It is not masculinity itself that creates these dangers, but rather the absence of an ethical framework that shapes it into something noble. Masculinity requires restraint and purpose, and both of these are cultivated by moral clarity. A man who does not know what he stands for or why his actions matter will almost inevitably use his strength in ways that are harmful to himself and others. The virtues of honesty, courage, responsibility, and compassion serve as the boundaries within which masculinity can thrive and remain constructive. When masculinity is disconnected from these virtues, it no longer serves others, but instead seeks to dominate, control, or indulge in destructive impulses. This is where the common perception of toxic masculinity arises, though the problem is not masculinity but the corruption of it. For example, aggression without responsibility becomes violence, and ambition without discipline becomes manipulation. In such cases, the masculine drive is still present, but it is twisted, distorted, and misapplied. Rather than standing as a protector, the man becomes a predator. Rather than bearing burdens, he seeks to offload them onto others. The very traits that could elevate him and those around him are instead used to exploit and diminish. Society suffers when masculinity is allowed to drift without responsibility or moral foundation. Families fracture, communities weaken, and individuals are harmed when men neglect the responsibility to channel their strength toward constructive ends. The absence of responsibility does not create freedom. It creates chaos, because strength without direction inevitably collides with others in destructive ways. This is not a call to diminish masculinity, but to demand its proper alignment. When men accept responsibility, discipline, and moral grounding, their strength becomes a source of stability and inspiration. When they reject those virtues, their strength becomes a source of fear and harm. The difference between the two outcomes lies entirely in the willingness to embrace responsibility and to ground masculine energy in principles that serve more than just the self-power. Without responsibility becomes tyranny, and ambition without virtue becomes exploitation. Power in itself is not evil. It is a fundamental part of human existence. To act in the world, to make change, to lead, or to build requires power. The problem arises when power is pursued or exercised without a framework of accountability and responsibility. A man who seeks power merely for its own sake is not a leader but a tyrant in waiting. He may gain control, but that control is directed towards self, interest, and domination rather than service and stability. History is full of examples where unchecked power led to destruction, whether in politics, business, or personal relationships. What could have been a force for order becomes a tool of oppression when responsibility is absent. Responsibility is what binds power to justice, ensuring that strength is used to elevate rather than suppress. Without that tether, masculinity falls into corruption, because the natural drive for dominance loses its proper channel and instead consumes everything in its path. Ambition carries a similar danger when separated from virtue. Ambition is the desire to climb higher, to achieve more, to expand influence and capability. In its healthiest form, ambition fuels progress and innovation, inspiring men to create, lead, and improve the world around them. But when ambition is not anchored in virtue qualities such as honesty, humility, and integrity, it becomes a hollow pursuit. A man without virtue may achieve success, but it will be built upon exploitation, deceit, or the sacrifice of others' well-being. This type of ambition corrodes trust and leaves behind only resentment and destruction. Virtue gives ambition its legitimacy, transforming it into a path of genuine achievement that benefits not only the individual, but also society. Without virtue, ambition degenerates into a hunger for status and power at any cost, and that is the seed of exploitation. The union of power, ambition, responsibility, and virtue is what makes masculinity admirable. Power tempered by responsibility becomes protection. Ambition tempered by virtue becomes leadership. These qualities shape men into individuals who not only advance themselves, but also create opportunities for others, who do not exploit the weak, but instead shield them from harm. To separate power from responsibility or ambition from virtue is to hollow out masculinity, leaving behind only its destructive shell. This is where the notion of toxicity arises, not because masculinity itself is flawed, but because it has been stripped of the very virtues that make it worthy. When men seek power without responsibility, they become dangerous. When they pursue ambition without virtue, they become exploitative. The path forward is not to eliminate power or ambition, but to demand their alignment with responsibility and moral virtue. Only then can strength be trusted, and only then can ambition be admired. Masculinity at its best requires this balance, for it is the balance that ensures men use their capacities to build, protect, and inspire rather than to dominate, corrupt, and destroy mature. Masculinity channels strength into service, leadership, and protection rather than domination. The essence of maturity is the transformation of raw, untamed power into something purposeful and controlled. A boy may desire to prove himself through displays of aggression or dominance, but a man understands that true strength lies not in overpowering others, but in guiding, protecting, and serving them. Masculinity that matures does not deny its natural impulses. It refines them, directing energy toward the pursuit of responsibility and the creation of stability. This distinction between domination and service is critical, because one is rooted in selfishness while the other is grounded in sacrifice. Service is not weakness, but the deliberate act of using one's power for the benefit of others, an act that requires far more courage than mere conquest. Leadership, when expressed through mature masculinity, is not about control but about responsibility. A mature man does not simply demand obedience, he earns trust. His leadership is characterized by vision, discipline, and the ability to shoulder burdens that others cannot or will not carry. He recognizes that his role is not to exploit the people around him, but to guide them toward order and progress. Leadership, in this sense, is an act of stewardship, and stewardship is impossible without a foundation of integrity. A leader who uses his masculine energy to dominate is ultimately a tyrant, but a leader who channels it into service creates loyalty and respect that endure. Masculinity, when mature, expresses itself through the willingness to lead responsibly, not through the desire to impose control. Protection is another central element of mature masculinity. Throughout history, men have been called upon to protect their families, their communities, and their nations. This is not because women or children are incapable of strength, but because masculine strength is uniquely suited for this role. Mature masculinity accepts the responsibility of protection willingly, understanding that it requires sacrifice and sometimes even danger. Protection is not about dominance. It is about standing between chaos and the vulnerable, about acting as a shield rather than a sword directed inward. A man who embraces this role transforms his strength from a tool of intimidation into a source of safety. This is the essence of protective masculinity, the courage to confront threats, not for personal gain, but for the security of those who depend on him. The difference between domination and service lies in intention. Domination seeks to elevate the self at the expense of others, while service seeks to elevate others even at a cost to the self. Mature masculinity is measured by this willingness to sacrifice, to assume responsibility, and to use strength constructively. Without maturity, masculinity risks devolving into pride, aggression, or control. With maturity, it becomes the backbone of stability, the source of leadership, and the shield against disorder. It is not masculinity that is dangerous, but the refusal to cultivate it into maturity. For it is only when strength is refined into service, leadership, and protection that it achieves its highest and most noble form. Toxic masculinity manifests as recklessness, immaturity, and the exploitation of others. When masculinity is not disciplined or directed toward responsibility, it begins to rot from within, and its expression turns destructive. Recklessness is one of the clearest signs of this corruption. Instead of channeling strength into disciplined action, reckless men use it to prove themselves through unnecessary risks, often endangering not only their own lives but also the lives of those around them. Recklessness may appear as courage on the surface, but it lacks the grounding of wisdom and foresight. True courage involves facing danger when it is necessary, but recklessness ignores consequence altogether, confusing impulsive behavior with bravery. In this way, toxic masculinity distorts what could have been a virtue into a vice that destabilizes both the individual and society. Immaturity is another hallmark of toxic masculinity. An immature man refuses to grow up, shirking responsibility and seeking pleasure without considering the costs. He avoids discipline, rejects accountability, and resents any expectation that he should bear burdens. Masculinity, at its core, demands growth and responsibility, but immaturity clings to childish desires while wielding the strength of an adult. This combination is dangerous because it grants power without the wisdom to use it well. An immature man is easily seduced by pride, anger, and self-indulgence, and he leaves behind disorder wherever he goes. He becomes a destabilizing force in his family, his community, and even within himself, because he cannot rise above his impulses. Toxic masculinity emerges here not because strength is inherently flawed, but because it has been entrusted to someone unwilling to mature. Exploitation is perhaps the most destructive expression of toxic masculinity. When men use their power, influence, or authority for personal gain at the expense of others, they corrupt the very essence of what masculinity should be. Instead of protecting the vulnerable, they prey upon them. Instead of serving, they manipulate. Exploitation takes many forms: emotional, financial, physical. But at its heart, it is always the same: the use of strength not to build but to consume. This is the exact opposite of what healthy masculinity represents. Exploitation reveals a man who has abandoned responsibility altogether and chosen to pursue only his own desires, no matter the damage inflicted. Such behavior breeds resentment, mistrust, and fear, and it erodes the very fabric of relationships and communities. The consistent theme in all these manifestations is the failure to harness strength responsibly. Recklessness misuses energy, immaturity avoids responsibility, and exploitation corrupts authority. Together, they form the toxic shadow of masculinity unrestrained by discipline and moral grounding. This shadow is not masculinity itself, but its perversion, a warped reflection of what it was meant to be. Masculinity becomes toxic when it turns inward, consumed by selfishness rather than outward, devoted to service and protection. It is the absence of maturity, accountability, and virtue that transforms strength into recklessness, adulthood into immaturity, and leadership into exploitation, leaving behind a trail of destruction where there could have been stability and growth. The world needs stronger men, but guided by integrity, responsibility, and virtue, not weaker men. Strength has always been the foundation upon which societies are built. But strength in itself is not sufficient unless it is directed by higher principles. When people call for weaker men, what they often mean is a desire for less aggression, less domination, and less harm. But weakness does not solve these problems, it only creates new ones. A weak man cannot defend his family, cannot withstand adversity, and cannot carry the burdens that life inevitably imposes. Weakness is not virtue because it lacks the capacity for action. Virtue arises only when strength is present and under control. To demand weakness from men is to misunderstand the nature of morality, for morality does not come from the absence of power but from the disciplined use of it. A man of integrity is not one who has no strength, but one who refuses to misuse it. Integrity binds masculine energy to truth and honesty, ensuring that actions are aligned with principles rather than with selfish impulses. It prevents strength from becoming manipulation, and ensures that ambition is not corrupted into deceit. Integrity transforms the raw drive for dominance into a commitment to fairness and justice, making strength trustworthy. Without integrity, even the strongest man becomes a danger, but with it, his strength becomes a source of stability for all those who depend on him. Integrity is the anchor that prevents masculine power from drifting into corruption, and it is one of the pillars that distinguishes a strong man who serves from a strong man who exploits. Responsibility is equally critical. Strength without responsibility is dangerous because it lacks direction, but when responsibility is embraced, masculine strength becomes a shield rather than a weapon. A responsible man does not look for ways to escape burdens. He actively seeks them, understanding that his role is to bear weight so others can thrive. He takes on challenges not only for his own advancement but also for the good of his family, his community, and the broader society. Responsibility refines strength into service, channeling energy into constructive action. Without responsibility, strength turns inward, feeding selfishness, but with responsibility, it creates order, stability, and growth. Virtue ensures that strength and responsibility remain oriented toward what is good. It is virtue that guides decisions, shapes character, and prevents men from abusing the power they hold. Virtue demands humility, reminding strong men that their strength is not for domination but for contribution. It also demands courage, because choosing to act morally often requires sacrifice. Virtue elevates masculinity beyond survival and competition, transforming it into a force that builds civilizations rather than tearing them apart. The call for weaker men ignores this truth. Weakness does not create safety or justice. It simply leaves a vacuum where strength should be. That vacuum is quickly filled by chaos, disorder, or by those who wield power without virtue. What the world requires is not the abandonment of strength, but its cultivation. Not the diminishing of men, but the refining of them into individuals who embody integrity, responsibility, and virtue, so that their strength becomes a force for good rather than a source of harm. The critical choice is whether men will develop their strength responsibly or allow it to corrupt into toxicity. Every man possesses within him the potential for both creation and destruction, for building order or sowing chaos. Masculinity is not a fixed outcome but a force that must be shaped, directed, and refined. The decision of how to use strength is what determines whether it becomes a blessing or a curse. A man who chooses to discipline himself, who accepts responsibility, and who acts with integrity, channels his masculine energy into something constructive. He becomes a source of stability and inspiration, someone others can rely upon when challenges arise. But the man who refuses to take on responsibility, who indulges in selfishness, and who seeks only to dominate or exploit, allows his strength to rot into toxicity. That is not inevitable, it is a matter of choice. Strength developed responsibly is not only beneficial to the individual, but also to everyone around him. A man who embraces responsibility can withstand hardships, protect his family, and contribute meaningfully to his community. He becomes a builder of trust and a defender of stability, the type of person others turn to in moments of crisis. This is because responsibility transforms power into service, ensuring that the energy men naturally possess is used for growth and not destruction. The responsible man understands that strength is not about what he can take, but about what he can give. Not about control, but about sacrifice. That is the choice that elevates masculinity from something raw and dangerous into something noble and enduring. On the other hand, when strength is left unchecked or undirected, it inevitably corrupts. A man who chooses to neglect responsibility becomes reckless and self-indulgent. He seeks pleasure without considering its cost, control without earning respect, and recognition without sacrifice. Such a man is not powerful in the true sense of the word. He is dangerous because his strength lacks a moral framework. Toxicity arises not because masculinity itself is flawed, but because the individual has chosen the path of corruption rather than discipline. Power becomes tyranny, ambition becomes exploitation, and confidence becomes arrogance. The same energy that could have built stability instead tears it apart, leaving disorder and harm in its place. This choice between responsible strength and corrupted strength is not a one-time decision, but a daily struggle. Every day presents opportunities to act with discipline or to indulge in selfishness, to take on burdens or to avoid them, to use strength in service or to use it in domination. Men who recognize this reality understand that their character is forged through constant effort, through the willingness to do what is difficult rather than what is easy. Developing strength responsibly requires humility, courage, and perseverance, because it demands sacrifice. Allowing strength to corrupt requires nothing but apathy and indulgence. Destruction. Masculinity is not the problem, its misuse is. When strength is united with integrity, responsibility, and virtue, it becomes the foundation of families, communities, and civilizations. The task before men is not to abandon their power, but to discipline it, to shape it, and to use it in service of something greater than themselves. The future depends not on weaker men, but on stronger men who choose to rise responsibly,